Then we started to take a deep dive into some of the major problems that are plaguing Canada: high crime rates, poor economy, and the misconception around the environment. Welcome to the Canadian Shield. My name's Sterling. Now that Mark Carney and the Liberals, especially Mark Carney, Stephen Guilbeault, and Julie DeBrusin, who are easily the top three zealots, the environmentalists of the Liberal Party and of Canada, we can start to look at the reality of what their decision is and how, by not being honest with Canadians, they actually put Canada into a lot of jeopardy. Now, the oil and gas industry is thriving all over the planet, just not in Canada, because Mark Carney doesn't want it to be doesn't want anything but low carbon. There's no way in the world that we can export electricity in a can. It just doesn't work that way. So there's no way that we're going to be able to become an energy, any kind of a power, if we don't have someone that's going to buy the energy. Oil is increasingly being developed all over the planet, and the demand for that oil grows with every single passing day. And that's also relevant to the conversation, because we hear words like cap and trade, and we hear words like carbon credits without understanding specifically how they may or may not be functioning in particular governments. So what we need to look at as a culture is how it's not so much voting against Donald Trump or voting against Pierre Poilievre or voting against most of the industry that only men occupy. It is, however, looking after what is best for the world that you have around you, and how, in comparison to countries that don't have any development at all, we can see how the world switches and only a certain segment of society gets to have any of the goods that are currently present. And how, by dragging yourself backwards through the development, by dragging yourself into the Stone Ages or into the Dark Ages, you actually harm or threaten the existence that you currently possess. So it's not so much about how far are we going to go forward, as the question is, how do we stop ourselves from going backwards? Before we get into this, let's establish something right out of the gate. There's only one form of government that merges big business and government together. It was very prevalent in 1920s Italy, very prevalent in 1930s Germany, and very prevalent in modern day China. There's only one ideology that brings business and government and puts them hand in hand. When you want to be a capitalist, when you want to talk about being free, when you want to have no regulation, you must be looking at a different form of government, which is truer to the democratic model than any of the others. Don't have to take my word for that. You can look that up. That's important, however, to understand that where you're getting your sources of information may be impacting what is being said. If you don't have a news source that's being neutral, and of course that's the biggest problem with the media in Canada, the corporate media is not neutral. So they play on your heartstrings, and they try to terrify you, and they only tell you one half of the story, which causes you to make decisions that benefit them. Now, what I'm trying to understand is who out there tells themselves that the best thing I can do is make the wealthy and powerful happy. I mean, who tells themselves that's going to make my life the best by giving more power and more juice to the people that already have it? I don't know that many people that do. I know a lot of people that say quite the opposite. So that's important to this conversation, because a lot of times the information that you're being given is just like half a truth, or it is a whisper of a truth, but in the reality, the spin, right? It's the spin that you got to look out for. And that matters in our conversations, because as we move forward through these topics, we have to ask ourselves who benefits the most. Now, from my perspective, I believe that the middle class is the one that should benefit from all of our decisions. If the middle class, if the bulk of the population is not gaining, if the poorest and the least educated and the least opportunities among us are not being brought upward, Whereas if by the other model, those that are already at the top get more and those that are at the middle and the bottom get shoved down. So I have one guiding principle in this, and that may or may not temper my answers, but it certainly is where I'm coming from, if that makes any sense at all. So now we'll dive into the subject of the video, which is the Bill C-69, which is an oil and gas emissions cap, and how it's going to negatively impact Canada, because what we need to worry about is the bulk of the population, not the very few. The few at the top are already living very well, and they can do just fine the way that they are. It's the rest of us that have to improve our standard of living. It's the rest of us that have to start living with less stress and less concern and less worry and less fear. And by shutting down an entire industry that targets a specific section of the country, well, two specific sections if you include Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, then we begin to look at how improving the standard of living for the smaller people will generate the tax in base income instead of borrowing against our credit rating with international bankers and putting all of our natural resources at risk, turning us potentially into a banana republic where foreign international outfits come in and take all of your natural resources out of the country, leaving the people that live there very destitute and enriching themselves in other countries. We'll take a look at how the oil and gas industry of Bill C-69 and the also as a ramification, as a spill out, any of the development that they were promising to do up north. Because without the resources or the desire to get the ships out, there's no reason to put a deep water port in some of the ports that they're referring to, including Churchill. Mounting evidence suggests emission cap will harm Canadians. This is by the Fraser Institute. I will leave a link in the description. In a recent interview with CTV, Prime Minister Mark Carney said he may eliminate Bill C-69, which imposes uncertain and onerous review requirements on major energy products and eliminate the cap on oil and gas emissions, so energy projects can quote-unquote move forward. Of course, actions speak louder than words, and Canadians will have to wait and see what the current government will actually do. But one thing's for certain, reform is needed now. Of course, we already know from the first day in the House of Commons when the environment minister was asked about the pipeline going to British Columbia by a person representing the British Columbia First Nations, or an individual in Newfoundland, where they also have the highest unemployment in the country, that no pipeline is planned by the Liberal government. It will have to be a low carbon, low cost, and low something else that she added to it, because I think they believe that it's somehow going to be a catchy phrase. What I hear is low economy, low standard of living, low money in your pocket. Last year, when the Trudeau government proposed a cap on greenhouse gases, which they'll refer to as GHGs, emissions exclusively for the oil and gas sector, it insisted that this was essential for fighting climate change and building a strong, thriving economy. However, a recent report by the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer suggests this policy, which would require oil and gas producers to reduce their emissions by 35% below 2019 levels by 2030, could lead to significant job losses, reduced production in the sector, and more broadly, yes, prosperity for Canadians. The PBO's findings add to mounting evidence indicating that the emissions cap will harm Canada's already struggling economy while yielding virtually no measurable environmental benefits. 2019 levels, they have a hard time measuring these levels, so I'm not sure where they're getting their numbers from, but I can appreciate that by trying to go 35% below 2019 by 2030, that's a pipe dream. Because Canada's production is too small when you can put it up against Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, or when you try to put it up against what the Americans are currently doing. When you look at the development in the North Sea from Norway, there's a lot of countries out there that are producing oil and gas, and they don't have any concerns about the emissions. So because they don't have any concerns about the emissions, it's all hands on deck. Everybody's getting paid. Then they take that paycheck and they spend it in the economy. They buy shirts, they buy boots, they buy beer, they buy food, they give it to their spouse, they put it in the bank, and they generate a stable and stimulate the economy. which is why they were referred to as prosperity, because it's not just about the individual getting paid, oh, let's find him another job. It's about the individual getting paid and then spending that money in the community. That's what prosperity looks like. Before we finish the article, I want to go over the report that they mentioned from the PBO, which I will leave a link for in the description. Now, the report is it's extensive, but I will go through the key results just for you and I right now. In the absence of a proposed oil and gas emissions cap regulation, our baseline scenario indicates that upstream oil and gas emissions will exceed the legal upper bound of 160 megaton by 7.1 megaton annually on average over the first compliance period of 2030 to 2032, meaning when they want to have 35% lower emissions by 2030 of the 2019 levels by 2030, what is currently happening, what he says, in the absence of proposed oil and gas emissions cap regulation, meaning that if they just continue along the way that they're going right now, they're going to miss those targets by 7 megaton. If you take 160 and you say that I missed by 7.1%, I think we're somewhere in maybe 11 or 12%. And when you consider the amount of times that the government overshoots their budget, or the amount of times that companies and development overshoot their budget by much more than 10%, this is quite reasonable, even if we leave aside the rest of it. This target is quite reasonable. Of course, Stephen Guilbeault and Julie DeBrusin and Mark Carney are not reasonable people. They are fixated on this one thing because they feel that it's going to make them a hero with the rest of the world. They honestly believe that they're going to have a long-standing, significant impact. They truly believe that. And when you're dealing with somebody who's a zealot, when you're dealing with somebody who's a fanatic, there's never any room for reason, unfortunately, which is why you see what we have going on around us. Anyway, let's get back to it. To achieve the legal upper bound, we assume proportional reductions in conventional oil production, oil sands production, and natural gas production and processing. We estimate that production in these subsectors will need to be reduced by 4.9% over the 2030 to 2032 period relative to the projected levels of our baseline scenario. That said, under the proposed oil and gas emissions cap regulation, total production from these upstream subsectors is projected to be 11.1% higher on average over the 2030 to 2032 compared to the current levels. So that's the 7.1, it's 11.1%. We estimate that the required reduction in upstream oil and gas sector production levels will lower real gross domestic product, GDP, in Canada by 0.39% in 2032 and reduce nominal GDP by $20.5 billion. Now, appreciate that the GDP just grew 0.5% and the Liberals were cheering. By reducing the GDP by 0.39%, why is that okay? Further, we estimate that achieving the legal upper bound over the first compliance period will reduce economy-wide employment in Canada by 40,300 jobs and full-time equivalents by 54,000 jobs. 50,000 people. That's the kind of jobs we're targeting for this pipe dream. While India and Pakistan and I don't point those countries out to try and drag them into the light, but to say these are populous countries that are struggling to become modern countries, and they are taking every drop of oil that they can get their hands on. Every last drop. Lastly, the key result was our estimate of the emissions reduction in the upstream oil and gas sector required to achieve the legal upper bound falls within the range of external estimates. Similarly, our estimates of the corresponding reduction in projected oil and gas production levels and economy-wide real GDP impact are within the range of external estimates. That last part was just to say we feel like what we just told you is accurate. Parliamentary budgetary officer is the guy that their task is to ensure that what the government wants to spend, what the outcome and the ramifications are. They're not politicians. They are, in fact, statisticians, economists, those kinds of things. They work with math. That's what they do. So I trust their numbers and I trust their estimates. Of course, remember that their estimate is based on the current model. If for whatever reason we were to all of a sudden up the development, we would now know how those numbers would have to change. Or if for whatever reason a pipeline got blocked and that productivity dropped off the face of the earth, those numbers would alter. It's based on the current model. And that's why it's called a model, because it's only what's in there and it's a projection. They just take a calculator out and they do the math. However, they're not normally politically motivated. Numbers don't really have politics. They don't have feelings either. Factor that into what you've just heard, and how, despite how they may vote, the information tells us that even if we were to keep on our current path, we would only overshoot the estimates by 11%, which would mean that we've come under 2019 levels by 24%, which is a much more larger production than they're doing, say, in the United States, where they don't have an emissions cap at all, or in China, where they don't have an emissions cap, or in any of 100 countries I could list off that don't have emissions caps in any way, shape, or form. We've still managed to come down 25%. And of course, that's not good enough for the Liberal government, because they're not being reasonable, right? They don't want to be reasonable. They want to have this idea that only they have the last say. And you need to remember that when you cast your vote. They're Liberal in name only. Eh? Okay, let's get back to the main article here. Oil and gas form the backbone of Canada's economy and trade. As the country's main export, the sector contributed nearly $8 billion in income taxes to federal and provincial governments, while adding $74.3 billion to the overall economy in 2024. More importantly, the oil and gas sector provides employment to more than 140,000 Canadian families, offering well above average salaries. Several studies have assessed the potential impact of the proposed GHG cap. While estimates vary, they all reach the same conclusion. The cap will force the industry to cut oil and gas production and, in turn, negatively impact or affect the entire economy. Now, before we go on, I want to stress and reiterate that it's $75 billion, and it's the largest export that we have in this country, and we are only exporting it out one border. If we were to export it out all four of our borders, that would, in theory, mean that it's $300 billion. And with the kind of $300 billion contribution to our economy, it doesn't matter where you happen to be living, you're going to be living okay. And in addition to that, we're going to have now the tax base and the other incomes generated to start to put development in the northern part of our country, which is significantly important to us, because it's the fact that we have not developed the northern part of our country that is allowing for Donald Trump's actions to be utilized by the Liberal Party against us. We're all crammed in along the border, and it's very close to trade with the United States. In addition to the close that's trade with the United States, who are spread out, right? Who have, because they have 10 times our population, they have cities in all of their regions. Of course, we could spread out our population that's crammed in, like 93% of the population in Canada lives along the bottom 5% of the country. Spreading out is irrelevant. It's important, and we must do it so that no other country can ever say we're stopping trading with you and it's going to cost us 100,000 jobs and kick us right into a full-on economic collapse, because that's what I project is going to happen, based solely and completely on Mark Carney's actions. The Liberal Party is not doing anything to alleviate the problem. I don't want to have two topics in the one video, so I'll get back to the article. There's also a report by Dolomite, which found the cap will reduce oil in production by 626,000 barrels a day by 2030 and lead to a decline in oil and gas production of 10% and 12% respectively, 2030, 2032. Overall, the country will experience an economic loss equivalent to 1% of the value of the entire GDP, translating into the loss of nearly 113,000 jobs and a 1.3% reduction in government tax revenue. 1.3%, we can build a lot of stuff with 1.3% of all the money that's going into this country. But I'll come back to the GDP, where they said it's a 1% kick in the GDP, or a decline in the GDP. And the government right now is patting themselves on the back for a 0.5% improvement in the GDP. Now, I may have said GDP there too many times. What I'm trying to get you to understand is it's a lot of money. And where are we living? That money is not the driver to our every single day. Finally, a recent study found that capping oil and gas emissions would result in significant economic loss without generating measurable environmental benefits. Specifically, even if Canada were to shut down its entire industry by 2030, every last drop, turned off the taps no matter what, we're not producing oil and gas in this country, removing all the GHG emissions from the sector, the resulting global reduction in emissions would be a mere 4/10 of 1%, a figure too small to impact the Earth's climate. The available evidence indicates that the proposed GHG cap would come at a high economic cost while delivering limited environmental benefits. I'm going to go back to that other one again. So if we stopped making any oil at all, just everything, no oil, no coal, nothing. We were all riding around on bicycles, horse and carriage. The emission that the impact it would have is 4/10 of 1%. Now, for those of you that might not, like if those numbers are kind of throwing you off, let me put it to you in another way. If you are saying, here's $100, but I am going to tell you that I'm going to stop giving you that $100 because the savings is 40 cents. 4/10 of 1% of $100 is 40 cents. Now I ask you, when you're staring down the idea of an electric car, which won't work in our weather, when you're talking about how you're going to have to ride a bicycle to pick up your kids from daycare if you can afford to have children, when you're looking at a house that you can't afford, when you're looking at food prices skyrocketing through the roof, would you be willing to give back that 40 cents to have all of those luxuries returned to you? I mean, that's the question you need to be looking at, because we are not as populous as Asia. We are not as populous as Africa. And those regions of the world are actively pursuing trying to reach the levels that we in North America achieve. So, or in the Western world even. And they want every drop of oil they can get their hands on. They need it for heating, cooking their food. They need it for turning on the lights. They need it for all of the things that we use it for, except they are not developed yet. So if you imagine in your mind that an oil and gas executive who sees that the Canadian market is getting smaller doesn't turn to India and say, hey, I got a lot of oil. You want to buy it? They'll be like, sure, we'll take it all. So that we can get the same level of development as the Western world, and perhaps, as a result, become whatever it is, whatever the dream of it for that happens to be. But I would imagine it just means better hospitals, better schools, all the same thing that everybody else, all of the other cultures look for when they're trying to improve their standard of living. 40 cents. I mean, what are you talking about? And what I want to understand is how come the economist and the political science major, Stephen Guilbeault, and I don't know what Julia DeBrusen's education is, but I'll call it a lawyer. Why do they feel that negligible little impact, that tiny little amount, is worth destroying all of the prosperity and the standard of living of the entire country? Because if you believe for 1 second that $1 trillion going into the economy won't work its way up into the Yukon, won't work its way up into Nunavik, won't work its way into northern Quebec, won't work its way into Newfoundland, then you're not understanding how money works. Now, of course, if we get someone like Mark Carney, who owns the largest pipeline in Canada, he would have all of that money transferred only to him. But from my side of the coin, it's like, let's spread that cash out. Let's let everybody have a car, the whole 9 yards, a house they can afford, good food, fridge full of it, that kind of stuff. Before I go on to the obvious answer that many of you are out there saying, yeah, but we're going to make electric cars, which the industry in Canada has bottomed right out because globally nobody is interested in it except for cultures that are currently and actively pursuing getting cars. I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of some of the things that oil and gas manufacturers can utilize their byproducts for that you use every single day. And once we remove them, the cost of them or the availability of them will shoot through the roof. So some of them are plastic, right? So that's everything from your eyelashes right through to the things that hold your lipstick, to the shoes, the purse. Many of the products that you use for hygiene are wrapped in plastic. All the hospitals, the list of of uses for plastic is quite extensive. Clothing, synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, cosmetics, lipstick, shampoo, hairspray, asphalt, some other examples. But I clicked on one of the links because it was provided by the Canadian Petroleum, the Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And now it's a pretty big article, but I want to just go through the ones that they hear right here, right? Oil and natural gas are also the building blocks of numerous other products. Plastics, right? Speakers, smartphones, computers, cameras, televisions, clothing. Now I want you to listen to this one because this is relevant. Really relevant. It's all relevant, but this one should get your attention, especially if you're of a certain gender. Fibers include acrylic, rayon, polyester, nylon, and other materials, shoes, purses, petrochemicals for lightweight, durable, water-resistant properties. Now, there are some other ones: sports equipment, personal care products, derived perfume, hair dye, cosmetics, lipstick, makeup, foundation, eyeshadow, mascara, eyeliner, hand lotion, toothpaste, soap, shaving cream, deodorant, shampoo. Petroleum products are an aspirin, hospital equipment, many household products, rugs, pillows. There's so many things that we utilize. And there's a lot of things that you'll have to appreciate are now plastic that if they were turned back into steel, many people wouldn't be able to utilize. For example, one of the best ones I like to think about is a car. A car door is very light. A woman can hold her purse and her latte and reach over and close it. One of the reasons that you used to have to open the door for the car, one of the reasons, not the whole reason, but open the car for the girl was because it was made of solid steel and it weighed like 120 pounds. And it just was a bit heavy for her, not to get when she was standing up outside, but when she had to reach, when she sits down, you want to reach over and get it from a seated position with one arm. It was simply too heavy. Then we make the cars lightweight and all the rest of that now. So that's no longer a problem. It's just an example of how by removing the plastics from the culture, though, yes, we should be looking at more efficient ways to recycle them. We certainly cannot pull them out and not have that impact the daily life of some segments of our society. Children, all of the people who benefit and don't understand how the weight difference and the durability difference between the two products. Now, I know I said all the makeup and the plastic eyelashes and all those kinds of things, and that's all true. But the one that I want to point out too that people overlook is yoga pants. If you don't want yoga pants, then I guess not worrying about petroleum products is fine. But yoga pants rely heavily on the fibers that we can manufacture from petroleum products. They are, I haven't seen, there's probably 1 trillion of them running around the earth, yoga pants. I don't know, but it seems like they're everywhere. It seems like every woman's got a go-to pair of yoga pants in her closet. So I don't know necessarily that you care about that. I'm only trying to draw it to people's attention who think oil and gas stops with just whatever you put in your car. And I haven't even discussed the amount of influence this is going to have on the everyday items like the stove and the fridge and the air conditioner. And the ramifications are large. It's not just about the simple argument of the jobs and the emissions. It's not just about the simple argument of how much money it makes and how you put it into your car. It is an integral part of the culture in which we live. And the removal of that will take us back in time to a time when they didn't exist. So let's just say, 1850, something to that effect, because the development of it, led for the improvement of the automobile. So even if we call it 1890, 1910, I'll give you. What I'm trying to get you to understand is that the implications and the ramifications are much larger than just let me not put it in my car and drive an electric car, as opposed to understanding the total impact that this has on our culture as a whole. And not to mention that, not just the products, but all the jobs that those products enable. Even if for the sake of argument, the electric battery was a viable replacement for the vehicle, which it is not. The uses of petroleum products is quite extensive inside of our culture. And it is extensive in a beneficial manner. Yes, of course, often times we have to be talking about how to get rid of them, how to throw them away. However, the product itself is improving the quality and the caliber of people's lives every single day. And I want you to realize that you're taking it for granted by telling yourself that the petroleum products only starts and stops with what goes into your car. And I want you to further realize that the media arm of the political establishment, like the CBC, the CTV, are also refusing to indicate to you where these benefits to society lie. They don't want you to realize that what you would be giving up will far outstrip anything that you may gain. Now, I'm going to have to do a separate one about the collapse of the electric auto industry, especially as it pertains to the billions of dollars the Canadian government and various organizations inside of Canada gave to this industry for it to collapse. I'm just going to read a couple things out of this article so we can wrap up this episode. EV fantasy losing charge on the taxpayer dime. I mean, that's just a terrible pun. I didn't write it. The vision of an all-electric transport sector shared by policymakers from various governments in Canada may be fading fast. The latest failure to charge is a recent announcement by Honda, which will postpone a $15 billion electric vehicle project in Ontario for 2 years, citing market demand or lack thereof. Adding insult to injury, Honda will move some of its EV production to the United States, partially in response to Trump's tariffs, but any focus on tariffs is misdirection to conceal reality. Failures in the electrification agenda have appeared for years, long before Trump's tariffs. Now, I have told regular listeners of the Canadian Shield, and I will tell any of you that are new, automakers will delay because they don't want to tell you that they're not going to do it. So they say, well, we're going to delay. And then quietly, when you're no longer looking at it, they just never bring it up again. It's done all the time. Ford's been doing it since the 80s. So don't, in your mind, think that they're going to somehow revive it in 2 years. Don't put any hope in that. There's no way in the world they're going to be bringing that industry back to Canada. Not just because there's no market in Canada, but because all of the people that had claimed to be investing in Canada have collapsed. The companies themselves no longer exist in many cases. For example, in 2023, the Quebec government pledged $2.9 billion in financing to secure a deal with Swedish EV manufacturer Northvolt. Ottawa committed $1.34 billion to build the plant and another $3 billion worth of taxes, incentives they'll call it. So far, according to the CBC, the Quebec government has invested $270 million in the project, and the provincial pension investor, which is a bank called the Caisse Populaire, has also invested $200 million. In 2024, Northvolt declared bankruptcy in Sweden, throwing the Canadian plans into limbo. And Northvolt has further declared asset and bankruptcy protection in the United States because nobody's buying these batteries. Last month, the same Quebec government announced it will not rescue the Lion Electric Company from its fiscal woes, which became obvious in December of 2024 when the company filed for creditor protection, again, long before Trump. According to the Financial Post, Lion thrived during the electric vehicle boom, reaching a market capitalization of $4 billion in 2021, growing to 1,400 employees in the next year. Then the market for the electric vehicles went through a tough period, and it became far more difficult to manufacture and raise capital. The Quebec government already lost $177 million on the investment, while the federal government lost $30 million by the time the company filed for creditor protection. And last year, Ford delayed production of an electric SUV in Oakville. Unicom halted spending of $2.8 billion battery material plant in Eastern Ontario. General Motors announced it will close the Cami electric van assembly plant in Ontario. And I could go on, but I'm going to do a different article. I'm going to have to do a different episode on the collapse of it because there are so many of these companies that they said, no, it's all going to be wonderful. Philips Champagne stood up, hey, we got everything happy for the user. There's going to be an investment of the thing in Windsor, and we're going to build everything, and it's going to be all wonderful and glorious and fancy. And I can still remember hearing him say it because he was innovation minister then, right? And every time you need to put that guy out in front, there's something to be suspicious of. And here we can see what it was, that all these billions were promised and all of these billions were, some of them probably went out, 30 million here, 40 million there. Where'd that end up? Well, maybe in somebody's bonus, maybe in somebody's pocket, maybe it went to a worker. Either way, it's a collapse of the industry in Canada, meaning the collapse of the industry on the earth. there's nobody buying the cars. And the battery, an electric car doesn't work in Canada. Even if it did work inside of the cold weather, there's no charging stations for it. We don't have them on houses. They're not set up in the apartment buildings. There's just no way in the world that we could ever hope to roll this out. And we get only 6 months until the federal government of Mark Carney, Stephen Guilbeault, and Julie de Bruzen think that we should make at least 20% of the cars manufactured and sold in Canada to be electric. Maybe they should expand that to mean scooters, and we can get the 14-year-olds driving back and forth to school to fill to pull up the percentages. Because there's no way in the world that the market in Canada is going to purchase 20% of the electric vehicles. Those are going to be sitting on the lot, no doubt about it. And who's going to make them? If Ford's not making them, and Chrysler's not making them, or General Motors isn't making them, and who's making them exactly? Are we just going to, does Brookfield own an electric car manufacturer? Is that the idea? Is that what I don't know about? Truth be told, there is only one company that's making electric vehicles that's turning a profit, and the federal government has attacked him. The federal government has said anybody that works for his company is not eligible for the rebates that they promised. The federal government has not only gone after him personally, but they've gone after the company inside of Canada, and have gone after the satellite company that he works with, have gone after many of the things that Elon Musk's Tesla have touched. So the only electric car manufacturer on the face of the earth that's generating a profit is the one company that the Canadian government of Mark Carney, Stephen Guilbeault, and Julie de Bruzen will not deal with. And that's kind of really funny in my mind, to think that they'll either have to apologize out loud and bring in all these Teslas to fulfill that 20% of the market share, or they're going to have to abandon the plan altogether, which is probably what I would do. Is I would just simply abandon the plan altogether, because it's never going to work outside of maybe one or two cities, and it will never achieve 20% of the market. However, I will leave that discussion for another video. I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. You let me know what you think down in the comments. I'll talk to you next time.